loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me, for the Bible tells me so.
I'm Bishop Joseph Tolton. Over the last 90 days, everything has changed. The world is different. The nation is different. And I'm sure that you are different. As a global village, we are in the initial days of a massive social, political, and economic transformation. The assumption of American capitalism being the ideal economic system and America's social structures as the envy of the world, this has been challenged. We once believed that in this, the land of opportunity, all that one had to do was to dream big, work hard, and obey the law, and that this would automatically result in positive economic possibilities for you and for your family. Between COVID and the cops, this idea as the promise of America has been shattered. For the lived reality of African Americans has been revealed for the world to see, creating a climate and an appetite for a new racial justice awakening. But this clarion call is not being heard just here in the United States. It is echoing around the world. I am so privileged and blessed to have been joined in this conversation by Professor PLO Lumumba, one of the most premier Pan-Africanists on the continent of Africa. Also joining me are Pastor Darrell Rich, Pastor David Ochar, Pastor Caroline Ombolo, Sister Dora King, Sister Imani Countess, and Brother Louis Lusinje. Enjoy. What would your message be to African Americans who believe that it is time for them to look inward and focus squarely domestically from a domestic frame on our current issues, and that the idea of a Pan-Africanist frame might just be too much work or not timely? What is your message to that thinking?
That would be most unfortunate. I believe that the long-term health of African Americans within the continent of America not only requires but demands that they enjoy solidarity with their kith and kin wherever they may be, particularly in the continent of Africa. If the voice of Africa becomes loud and clear and unequivocal, whoever occupies position of power in the seat of power in the United States of America will know that these Black people in the United States of America are not alone.
Yes.
They are supported by 1.2 billion of their kith and kin. And if we mess up with them, we are going to be dealt with. And when we talk about being dealt with, we are talking about being dealt with in the economic area, in terms of trade. We are going to be dealt with in the terms of international relations. We are going to be ostracized in the international community. And if you are ostracized by 1.2 billion, that is something that concerns you. So it is in the best interest of African Americans to build the bonds between them and their kith and kin. And it is in the best interest of Americans that even as much as they invest in the United States of America, they should now begin to look to the continent for purposes of participation and investment. So this is not the time to think that we have our domestic problems. Your domestic problems are going to be solved through your solidarity with your kith and kin, not only in the continent of Africa, but in the Caribbean and in Latin America and wherever they are in other parts of the world.
One of the things that I think is important to lift up is that before we were slaves in this country, we were actually prisoners and we were incarcerated. And so when we think about the penal system and the relationship that African Americans have with the police, I think it's important that we understand the fact that when we touched this land, we actually came here as the incarcerated. And it is deeply ingrained in the American society that should be our status. Pastor Rich, just help us to frame the issues and give us a sense as to what is happening with the African American experience today.
To your point, the forcible movement of what is conservatively estimated between 10 to 12 million Africans from the continent, it constituted more than the movement of bodies. And I think that's the thing we often neglect from our conversation. It wasn't just the movement of bodies, it was actually the disruption of a sociocultural fabric. It was a disconnection from the griots, from the sages, from the elders of the community. It removed us from our ancestral worship practices and indigenous epistemologies. It disconnected us from our innovation, from our ingenious ways. So deculturation started east of the Atlantic as they were stripped of their royal garments, as they were stripped from clans, from tribes. Deculturation started there and was carried across the Atlantic. So this movement from the transatlantic slave trade, from Middle Passage into the antebellum South, to your point, as an incarcerated people, but not only, and I'm gonna try to make this very quick, I set this up as, again, 4 frames, 4 moves, if you will. So the first move is the Middle Passage. The next move is slavery. The third move is Jim Crow and civil rights. And then the last move has more to do with Black Lives Matter. We get to Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, and the senseless killing of Black men and women at the hands of the police. And so we're talking about excessive force, the over-policing in Black communities, and militarization. We get Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. And so what we're seeing right now has not happened outside of a vacuum. What is happening now is actually built within this whole historical framework. We wouldn't understand what it means to be Black bodies in public space, i.e. white space,
Yes.
had we not first been incarcerated here.
That's right. Marcus Garvey, who built the largest social justice movement for Black people in our experience, even larger than the civil rights movement, which is not often noted. He was very clear in building the United Negro Improvement Association that it was a global movement to bring together this great race of those of us that are Black people of African descent. Certainly in the 1960s, when we were having our liberationist movement, Dr. King was in touch with Nkrumah, who of course studied in New York at City College, and they shared lessons learned and ideology and methods and practices. Young people, particularly African Americans, are not aware of this history of connectivity.
Which was by design. The whole idea of creating the chasm, if you may,
Yes.
between the African Americans and the Africans in the mother continent was one that was deliberate.
Yes.
If you look at the early writings of people like Carter G. Woodson in 1933 in his book, Miseducation of the Negro,
Yes.
he is capturing that reality in a very poignant and in a very pointed way. He is saying that the African who was transported to the Caribbean or to the American mainland or to Latin America in Brazil or Colombia or any one of those Latin American countries or to Europe was taught a form of history that was designed to make him believe that he or she had no history at all, and that therefore there was no umbilical cord, if you may, between them and their kith and kin in the mother continent. This was deliberate.
Absolutely.
But we know better. It is through the efforts of people, therefore, such as Marcus Garvey, whom you mentioned very aptly, and later people such as W.B. Du Bois, that we begin to recognize that particular connectivity. And you can see, therefore, that as the Africans in the continent are struggling to regain their independence from the erstwhile colonizers, the involvement of African Americans is very real. People like W.B. Du Bois are involved. People like Malcolm X, a little later Martin Luther King Jr., and many others are involved in this enterprise. But remember that the whole idea of ensuring that we don't have our hands on the same deck is systematic, it is sustained, and is fed by propaganda. So the propagandization of negativity is in itself designed to create and to widen the chasm between African Americans and the Africans in the continent. So that even when places such as Liberia are created for the freed slaves, you still have the notion of the returnees and the indigents. And this is very deliberate.
Pan-Africanism is a concept, and it's quite hard to pinpoint on what exactly Pan-Africanism is, because there are so many interpretations of it.
Of course, there are different. There have been different attempts at defining what Pan-Africanism is and who a Pan-Africanist is. You must remember that the whole idea of Pan-Africanism started way back in the 19th century with the great Trinidadian, and of course people like Marcus Garvey, W.B. Du Bois, and crystallized very much in Manchester in 1945 at a meeting which was attended by people from the African continent, people like Kwame Nkrumah, Obafemi Awolowo of Nigeria, and W.B. Du Bois and Garvey, among others, the younger Garvey. And it was then understood, as it should be, and as I understand it, that a Pan-Africanist is one who believes in the unity of Africa for her political, economic, social, and cultural well-being. So the totality of it is what we call Pan-Africanism. And this is informed by the realization that the activity of the white tribes, if one were to be blatant about it, in Berlin in 1884 to 1885, divided the continent of Africa very arbitrarily. And this was very deliberate because they believed that if they divided us and indoctrinated us, they would then subjugate us and rule us in the manner that they have. So that the Portuguese then indoctrinated those whom they had colonized and made them believe that Portugal was the Alpha and Omega. Yeah. And they therefore gravitated towards Lisbon. Equally, the Spaniards did the same, the Germans the same, the French the same, the British the same, the Belgians the same. The net effect is that we are struggling. But we must look at it even further down the line. The whole slavery episode was an episode that was designed, number one, to dehumanize the African. I think Alex Haley, in his book Roots, which has also been dramatized with Liver Barton, which is the version that I love, with Liver Barton and John Amos as Kunta Kinte, captures the essence of the dehumanization of the African. But there is a sense in which whether you beat Kunta Kinte out of Toby, Kunta Kinte never dies. And that is why we are indeed now talking about Pan-Africanism and the desire of us who live in the mother continent and those of you who are in the diaspora to now begin to recognize that going forward, our salvation lies in our unity, geography notwithstanding.
As a woman of African ancestry who has had the experience of living here in America, do you think it is in fact true that African Americans are disinterested in Africa?
That question actually has a long history that discounts that assertion. First of all, just to go back to my own biography, I was born in Sierra Leone in Freetown, which is the capital city of Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone itself is actually a Pan-African, it's sort of an exemplary sort of Pan-African project. The first freed slaves who were settled there were called the Black Poor from England, from London. And then there were successive settlements of freed slaves who were settled in Freetown and who together built this community that came to be known as the Creoles, which is, the people I descend from. There were several groups of people who settled in Sierra Leone who actually came directly from America. And the first group actually were freed slaves who had fought on the side of Britain during the Revolutionary War. And they were promised freedom and were sent to Nova Scotia, which was a very inhospitable terrain for them to farm. And so they were sort of conscripted into this project of creating a freed society on African soil. They'd gone on ships and they were moved and transported back to Sierra Leone. And founded a community called the Province of Freedom. The Nova Scotians were, sort of one of the first groups that settled there. And then successively, after the slave trade itself was abolished, West Africans who were on the way to being settled in the Americas were rescued on the Atlantic and settled in Freetown. And so this community of Creoles is actually made up of African Americans, it's made up of European Americans, it's made up of West Africans from the north, from Mauritania all the way down to Angola. And they created this culture that was built on this quest for freedom and this quest to actually create a new society and a free society on African soil. But it's fundamentally Pan-African because it actually includes all these cultures and all these heritages, from all over the world, from the Black diaspora, from the African diaspora. So that is my personal story. But even apart from Sierra Leone, the history of African Americans actually returning to Africa is quite long. So apart from the Nova Scotians who went to Sierra Leone and Freetown in 792, in 1815, an African American by the name of Paul Coffey, who was a shipbuilder and a businessman, organized about 38 African Americans who went back to Sierra Leone to settle down. So 38 men, women, and children gone on a ship called the Traveler, and he settled them in Freetown in Sierra Leone. In 1821, the nation of Liberia was founded by, mostly a white-led society called the African Colonization Society. And the idea was to sort of civilize and Christianize and, return African Americans back to Africa. But it actually formed this nation, the nation of Liberia. And so this nation was founded by African Americans who wanted to return to Africa. In 1914, Marcus Garvey, as you mentioned before in your introduction, he was a Jamaican who was, born there. And in 1914, he formed this organization called the United Negro Improvement Association.
Yes.
And he was an exemplary, not only Pan-Africanist, but an African nationalist, a Black nationalist, who was vehement about the necessity for Africans and for Black people to claim their pride and to claim their history and their heritage and to have pride in it. interesting story, actually, that I discovered in my research was that one of my ancestors was actually a part of that movement. His name was George Mark. He was born in Sierra Leone, but he came to New York in the 1920s, and he was one of the officials of the UNIA. And he actually had a lot of conflict with Garvey. But this movement, I discovered, was actually in my personal history, which is incredibly exciting. And so, that project itself, unfortunately, sort of petered out because of, there was some...
Well, the project petered out because there were many in the establishment here in America who were very afraid of the power of what Marcus Garvey was doing. It could be argued that in the 1920s, the NAACP was incredibly impressed with itself and with social stratification and the politics of respectability. And the work of Marcus Garvey, they found very challenging. I am tremendously blessed by the historicity of Pan-Africanism that you've just lifted up. And I would argue that most African Americans and Africans are not connected to that sense of history and to that sense of connectivity.
I think that while without a doubt you're absolutely correct that there were attempts to divorce enslaved people from Africa, I don't think that it was a total severing. In terms of Pan-Africanism, I think that as our brother said, it means many different things to many different people. For me, what is common is the political thread that flows through those definitions. It recognizes, it's based upon a recognition that politically and economically, Africa and its diaspora has encountered a very similar set of circumstances.
That's right.
And that our response has historically been very similar. So there is this history, yes, of exploitation, super exploitation, both in Africa and in regard to enslaved Africans in the United States, the Caribbean, and South America. And there was also a resistance. And I think that's really, really important. And then also, for me, Pan-Africanism includes a recognition that given that history of similarity and pushback, real fight back, there's an interest, there is a benefit to us all coming together, and also to celebrate, that all the positive aspects, all that we've been able to create despite what has stood in opposition to us.
I lift up the question that Pan-Africanism, as I understand it, particularly from an African perspective, is often thought to be a project from Cairo to Cape Town. But can you talk to us about, is it time for Africans to more strongly articulate that Pan-Africanism is diasporic inclusive? What are your thoughts in that regard?
Thank you so much, Bishop. I think in terms of redefining Pan-Africanism, it's high time that happens to be more inclusive, and because the lenses through which Pan-Africanism has been understood and largely promoted within the continent. One, it has been sort of, I would say, maybe I stand corrected, but it has been, the approach has been more of looking at the Pan-Africanism as concerning only the continent of Africa. And that is largely understood by a majority of the people who live in the continent. And then, so this for me feels like a time that we need to broaden our understanding and redefine what Pan-Africanism should be moving forward in a world where the people of African descent have been mistreated, misused, and abused, and have been denied opportunities to prosper and to be autonomous. It is time that we should unite across the globe, from America to Africa to the Caribbean to Haiti to Brazil to Ecuador, all across the globe. People of African descent should come together in solidarity and define a way forward on how we can empower ourselves in different ways and, self-actualize as a people, and reclaim what actually my brother Doral was talking about. Reclaim our, spirituality. Reclaim our authenticity of people of African descent, because all this we were robbed. We were separated from our families. Our brothers and sisters were taken away from us to further lands that, and we were left, our families were left back home. And there was that gap that we as a people who actually share into the aspirations of Marcus Garvey, and I'm glad our founding father, Jomo Kenyatta, was one of the greatest Pan-Africanists, because he believed that Pan-Africanism does not only concern the people who live within the African continent, but our brothers and sisters who are taken in boats and into slavery and build to build the Western societies. And he believed we should never lose that connection, and if there's an opportunity for us to reconnect and just unite, because as Bishop we said previously, that blood never breaks. We need to reclaim on how we can utilize our progressive theology and ways of doing things currently, on how we can connect that with our vast, diverse African spirituality and diversities in sexualities and gender, to chart a way forward on an inclusive, empowered, and stronger, united force that will promote peace, that is going to promote unity and prosperity through all spheres of our economic, spiritual, and social life.
I was very happy, of course, President Nana Dankwa Addo Akufo-Addo of Ghana, when he introduced the year of return.
Absolutely.
Because he was demonstrating to African Americans that, remember, you always have a home.
Well, I actually think that it is an opportunity to embody and make real the promise, of the Pan-Africanist project, having folk return back to Africa and rebuilding Africa, and in a way elevating what it is we inherited, right? Elevating our cultures, our practices, our religious practices. I think that is one part of the project. But I also think that it's important for us sometimes to use stories to actually understand what these opportunities offer us and their limitations as well. So I want to draw everyone's attention to an article by an African American writer whose name is Jacqueline Woodson, who went back to Ghana to visit. And she said she went out of curiosity, but she was also cautious. And why? Because she's queer. And she went back with her family. She went back with her wife and her biracial children to test the waters, to see what Ghana was offering and, how would that feel? What does it mean to actually return to a place where her people were taken from forcibly with violence? The thing that, one of her insights that I think is really important for us to actually recognize and to think about as we want to pull on our sort of collective heritage of Pan-Africanism is what does it mean for not only Black bodies, but Black queer bodies, right, to return to Africa? What does it mean to build a new future? What does it mean to build a new present with the openness that's offered by Ghana, with the openness that's offered by Nigeria, and take into account the diversity of African peoples, of Black bodies, of Black expression, of Black sexuality, of religious practice. I mean, we are all aware of the increased conservatism that has sort of colonized the practice of religion in Africa through prosperity theology and through Pentecostal, sometimes theologies that are actually quite regressive, right? So I think that the Pan-African Project is our promise, but in many ways, because it also demands, it asks of us to come up with ideas and ways of thinking that will incorporate all of us, right? Including albinos, for example, people, minorities, populations in Africa who have historically been marginalized, people whose skin color, because they are different, are demonized, right? People who, because of their sexualities, are demonized, and demonized from the very top. Where the state actually practices violence against them, against their bodies. So I think that the invitation is a promise, and it holds so much potential for us to do the work that we need to do. And there's one thing that I wanted to mention, that this notion of the nation state, I think it's something that is, as Pan-Africanists, that we must actually interrogate and question, right? The ways in which it does exclude people like us who are queer, the way it excludes women, sometimes and children, from the benefits of citizenship. So I think that, the work that we have to do, I think, is both intellectual in terms of coming up with ideas and models and ways of thinking about what it means to belong, right? What does it mean to belong to Africa? What does it mean to belong to the places we come from?
And that I think you're right, that the ties with Africa were not fully severed. But I do think that the relationship is still a bit complicated in that, for example, Black History Month, we whip out our kente cloth, and we don't do it disingenuously, but we do it because that is a part of our celebration. But I've often argued that when we do that, it is because we are trying to grope our way towards an embrace of Blackness, perhaps, as opposed to an embrace of the continent. So I think it's a little bit complicated. Would you not agree?
I absolutely agree that it's complicated. And one of the complications, in addition to the difficulty of really embracing the continent and understanding, and that Black History Month sort of scenario that you point out is just so illustrative. We don't know Africa, right? And I encourage every African American, quite frankly, everybody, every white American too, to visit the African continent, because it is not what you have been taught. And for me, when I first traveled to the African continent, not only did I fall in love, really, with every country that I have had the privilege to visit, but I also found that my own identity as an African American was strengthened. And I think that this is a sort of a point that's also worth exploring, and that is identity, because I identify as an African American, and most Africans that I know, they may identify to a particular nation state. I'm a Zimbabwean, I'm a South African, I'm a Kenyan. More often than not, they may identify with a particular ethnic group. I'm Shona, I'm Zulu, I'm Kikuyu. And while some may look at that as sort of problematic, I actually think that it's part of the beauty. We have multiple identities, and we are all of African descent and have some common experiences that do draw us together.
Chimamanda Adichie argues in Americana that Africans don't actually know that they're Black. And for African Americans, we are defined by a sense of Blackness. How do we reconcile as a people if our skin color really does, as African Americans, define our experience, but perhaps in the African context, that is not how you define your sense of Blackness? I'm going to come to Pastor Darrell, but please tackle that for us, Pastor Omolo, if you would.
First question to you, Bishop. Do you always worry whenever you come to Kenya?
I do not worry when I come at all.
Yes. So we Kenyans, I'll take Kenya for example because it's a part of the African continent. When me myself, we don't feel the weight of our color that much because we live amongst our own color, that is Black. The neighborhood that we have is all Black. The leadership that we have is all Blacks. That is the only color we see. So we do not speak much of our skin color that much as the way African Americans would consider themselves as Black Americans. But as Africans, we were defined as Black people. So we know we are naturally Black. So we do not concern too much with our skin color. We see people talking about when they go to America that I'm going to a white bar or a Black bar, and here in we don't have that thing. Only the thing that we can worry about is I'm going to a tribal bar. Yeah, so we are more of tribal than racist because we only think about what other tribes are doing against other tribes. So most of the time when we Africans cross the continent to Europe, we carry ourselves the culture. That is what we carry, and that is what is dear to our hearts. In Europe, when we go, the skin color or the color of your skin becomes something to worry about, and it's also a concern because with us, we are just living our normal life of everybody being Black.
Let me ask you this.
Okay, Bishop.
When you see African Americans coming, now clearly and thank you for turning the tables and asking me that question, because I don't have any fears when I come to Kenya for so many reasons I don't. But I think that we need to interrogate this idea that some African Americans have, which is that we are first perceived as Americans and we are first perceived to be people of privilege. And that when Africans see us, they don't see us as their brothers and sisters, but they see our privilege. Could you speak to that just a bit?
I don't quite think that when we see you as privilege. The people we see as privileges are the white-skinned Americans. But when Black Americans come to our city, we see this person as a brother.
To go back to what Sister Caroline said, I remember when I first went to England to visit my sister over the holiday period. And then when we were walking down the street, then I had my hoodie. When I had my hoodie on, and because I felt it was cold, and I was feeling more macho and feeling nice with my hoodie on. And so as we walk down the street, she keeps on telling me, take off your hoodie. Then I asked her, but why should I take off my hoodie? Then she tells me, Black people you're considered a criminal when you have your hoodie on. So you need to take it off. Then that's when I actually realized that I was Black, I realized that actually I was Black, something that for me was never an issue in my entire life. And since then, I always watch to myself and be very careful and look, sort of this some sort of subconsciousness. Whenever I travel abroad, when I leave my country, then I realize, oh wow, I'm actually Black. So I can just imagine what that feels like when when you're in a society that's how you felt when you were born, that you actually your skin sort of defined who you are, and not in the positive way, but in a less inferior way.
In order to move into this promise and to really take Pan-Africanism to another level, you had the opportunity to go back home. And so a part of my question for you was, were you able to mine and have a sense for what clearly united you as a son of the soil, but also what parts of your experience might have distinguished you that your brothers and sisters on the continent did not have?
We have to hold all of that in tandem. And I like your phrasing, and I'm going to take that as far as being a son of the soil, yes, and daughters of the soil. Yes. I like that. Let me answer it this way as well, by saying, I think one of the things we have to recall, if as we're talking about new Pan-Africanism, as we're talking about reclamation, reclaiming a sense of who we are, we will also have to deal with social construction and how sociologically Black folk in America have been impacted psychologically and emotionally and spiritually because of these white frameworks, and so to be conditioned in that, to be born into systems, yes, that automatically categorize you as Black or African American, to be born into those systems which automatically categorize you as this or that. That's a conditioning, and so over time, I believe we actually start to understand what those labels mean. Okay, what does it mean for me to be a Black man here in America? To either live into whatever those stereotypes are, or to vehemently push back against them, because there is this inner struggle that says, no, I'm not that though. I'm a son of the soil. There's something else that keeps tugging, that keeps pulling me, that keeps resisting the white American social framework. No, you have said that I am this, but Africa says I am this. My people say I am this. For once in my life, I felt like I was home, and stepping my feet back on Ghanaian soil, and someone said it earlier that it wasn't. I didn't. This was my personal experience. I didn't feel as if I had to prove anything that I was your kin or your brother. I didn't have that. It was welcome home. And so I'm saying all that to say this, to your question, that because the African diaspora fans out from the West Coast and virtually, touches all points of the world, then I do believe our collective enterprise is needed to lift up the race to where we belong. And because of the historical legacy of racism as experienced in the Americas, social inequality, inequity, so forth and so on, the time is now. I believe fervently that the time is now for all of us of African descent, whether you find yourself located here in the Americas, in New Jersey or in Georgia, whether you find yourself in Brazil or Haiti or the UK, wherever you wherever the diaspora has sent you via your people, you have a role in raising consciousness in this reclamation project. The time is now, and it is for all of us to do.
I deeply believe that. I often tell people that if a couple and the mother's sister live in a house together and they have 10 children, and one evening in the middle of the night, capturers come and take away 4 of those children and the aunt, that it is not only the aunt and the 4 children who are traumatized, but those 6 children and that couple that remain were equally traumatized. And I believe that this is the era in which those 4 children and the aunt are making their way back to the home from which they were captured. But that home is also different because they might be captured, but several hundred years later, those same criminals came and they seized that home. They didn't capture them, but they seized that home. They took their wealth. They took over the home. They dominated the home. So that even within that home, there was such turmoil as it related to their own ability to determine their own destiny and their own sense of self. I think that here in the year 2020, between the crosswinds of science and technology, modernity, capital markets, entrepreneurship, matters of religion and culture, and the idea of Pan-Africanism, that all of these ideas are swirling, and that now, as people of African descent, we have an opportunity to answer, who are we? And to define ourselves. And I think that we should define ourselves together. America is on fire. The country is having to deal with the truth of racial injustices that have happened over 400 years, and in particular, the ways in which the penal system has literally had its foot on the neck of people of African descent. George Floyd was murdered in the most brutal and heinous and awful way. I have not heard an African leader yet publicly stand up and condemn the murder.
You know, there is a sadness in this. In fact, just this evening, I was asking myself, I want to hear the voice of the African Union in an unequivocal manner, coming out and saying that this is wrong. But the reason, and I'm saying this by dint or not of any evidence, but the reason why I think African leaders are not coming out is because they are second guessing themselves. They look at the United States of America as a big brother. You condemn her and then she will deny you aid. Yes. You condemn her and she will sanction you. You condemn her and she will do all manner of things against you. And the problem is that we have not, our African politicians at critical positions have not crossed the threshold of fear, the fear of the big brother. And this is very sad. And the beauty, however, is that the African population is ahead of the political class. And you have seen in different parts of Africa, in Nigeria, in Nairobi, Kenya, in Johannesburg, in South Africa, and different parts, the people in the street are coming out and dramatizing their anger and dissatisfaction. But if you expect anything from African leaders, you are expecting too much, because they ask too many unnecessary questions before they say that which ought to be said. They'd rather remain in the inner recesses of their quietness because they fear, what will America do if we condemn her?
Professor, I appreciate the fact that you've spoken to this younger population that is ready to speak truth to power in this regard. Outside of yourself, are there other leaders who are beginning to mobilize and amass and collectively organize the voice of these young people to speak to this more expansive and aggressive form of Pan-Africanism?
The political class in Africa is a class that does not, in my view, appreciate the fact that Pan-Africanism is ultimately the only way that will ensure the total liberation of the continent. And I'll give you 2 examples that demonstrate to me that the African politician is not really seized of the reality. Look at the manner in which the United States of America have dealt with Tedros Ghebreyesus, who is an African and the head of the WHO. Look at the manner in which the United States of America is trying to deal with the current president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina of Nigeria. The United States of America and its administration has thrived on bullying Africans and treating Africans really as little children, 10-year-olds who can be told what to do when and what not to do. And because we have been subservient for so long, the political class is very reluctant to rub America the wrong way. But as you have rightly said, the masses of the people are now beginning to realize that if you rely on your politicians, you are going nowhere. So there is a groundswell of dissatisfaction. And whether the politicians like it or not, I think the time is coming, and the time is now, when the masses are going to be the leaders and the politicians are going to follow willy-nilly.
The beauty of the moment is that it is going to give birth to a new era of civil rights organizing in our country. I deeply believe that that organizing must be connected to this spirit of Pan-Africanism that we're speaking to. What say ye to your African brothers and sisters as it relates to what we need from them in this moment when we're getting killed by COVID and the cops?
I think at the top of that list is pray for us. We need your prayers. We need your support. We need to hear your voices. We need to see you all marching in your street, holding banners up for us. And also, and I hope I don't step into some tepid waters here, but also we need you all to call on and teach us how to call on the power of the ancestors to support us in this moment.
I did hear a wonderful address from you speaking of the need for us to be far more compassionate in this moment. Please say more about your thoughts around a Pan-African response to COVID.
My view is, of course, that the COVID pandemic has had a devastating impact. And many times when I hear people talking about COVID-19, I smile because there will be no post-COVID-19. COVID-19, I think, is with us and its effects are with us. The question is, how will we learn to live with it, and how will we meet its very devastating effects? The reality and the truth is that most African economies are now devastated. Of course, conservatively, economists are saying that the economies will shrink by anything between 8 and 9 percentage points, but I think it is anything between 30 and 50% in certain countries. So how are we going to behave? You look at different sectors. The aviation sector today is going to lose nearly $1 billion United States dollars, and the aviation sector in Africa is very small. You are going to lose jobs in the millions, the mining sectors, because we are producing primary products. In agriculture, my own country, Kenya, has just imported maize from Mexico. You go into the hospitality industry and tourism time. But yet there is a sense in which in the midst of this gloom, there can be glitter. And the glitter that I'm beginning to see is that Africans are now beginning to recognize that they must do things for themselves. And I've seen a number of developments in the continent, the initiatives of the Malagasy Institute of Applied Science. They have come up with a possible cure for COVID-19, christened the COVID organic. I think that is the beginning of the opening of the pharmaceutical sector in Africa, which hitherto has been overly reliant on Europe and America and Asia. I've seen the Ugandans have come up, solar-powered car, and I hope that Africans are going to stop buying photon vehicles from China so that they invest in this. The Pasteur Institute in Dakar in Senegal is now making medical equipment. I hope that we are going to run pipelines from Nigeria through to East Africa and to North and to South, so that there is a great opportunity. Even in the midst of all this, to me, is the beauty of this. What we need, therefore, is a political leadership that is switched on. And I'm beginning to see a number of African leaders who are talking right. I hear the Tanzanian president talking right, the Rwandan president talking right, the Ghanaian president talking right, the South African president talking right, the Ethiopian president talking right. And these are, in my view, very, very useful conversations that we are beginning to engage in.
Professor, what is your message to these young people that are in the streets advocating for Black Lives Matter?
You know, I was thinking to myself only yesterday that if there is a God in heaven, and He is there, one day He'll ask of His white children, why are you so callous that throughout the ages you've been so unfair, Black brothers and sisters? You enslaved them and you are not satisfied. I gave you your land, you ran away from your land, you went to the land that I gave them, you took their resources. If there is a God in heaven, He'll ask His white children, when you stopped enslaving them, you did not stop there, you colonized them. If there is a God in heaven, He'll ask them. He'll ask them, you did not stop there. If there is a God in heaven, and He is there, you did not stop there. Even when you taken and they built a country for you, you still treat them as if they were not my children and not your brothers. The young men and women in the street are dramatizing their anger and their dissatisfaction. They are saying that what has been happening has been systemic. Nobody is condoning the looting, nobody is. But they are speaking what Martin Luther King Jr. rightly recognized as the language of the unheard. They have spoken. And the question was asked when Martin Luther King himself was killed was, don't ask who killed Martin, but what killed Martin. Mm-hmm. So today we must also not ask, well, who killed Floyd? We know the man who stepped on his neck until he could not breathe, but what killed him? Because he's not the only one, he's just the latest. So my message to them is that they should keep the spirit alive until white America recognizes that America is as much their land as it is their. It must be sustained. This must not just be yet an episode in this drama of anger. It must be sustained. That is my message to them, and it will be well with them if it is sustained.
as black people. Your suffering is our suffering. We are all brothers and sisters, people of Africa descent. We love you.
Welcome back home, African Americans. Yeah, Africa is your homeland. We are longing to see you come home, Africa. You are free on your land. Enough space for you, for you, for you. Ah, home sweet home. Home sweet home.
Yes, Africa loves you.
I love you, my people.
Yes, Africa loves you. We are all brothers and sisters. Yes, Africa loves you. For your peace. No. Yes, Africa, we love you. Here is your homeland. No, yeah. We love you too. For your people. My American, we come home. African Americans,
Yes, Africa loves me. Oh, yes, Africa loves me. Oh, yes, Africa loves me. For my people have told me so.